morning. Please take your seats. We're ready to begin.
Let me get back to you, Steve. Thanks. Okay. So we held it in the whole
Good morning. We'll call this meeting of the Committee on the Judiciary to order. I'll ask the clerk to take the roll to ascertain the presence of a quorum.
Delegate Hanshaw.
Present.
Delegate Capito. Delegate Queen. Delegate Zatezalo. Delegate Lovejoy. Delegate Lane. Delegate Canistraro. Delegate Holland. Delegate Sabonia. Delegate Deem. Delegate Pushkin. Delegate Foster. Delegate Summers. Delegate Miller. Delegate Eisner. Delegate Moore. Delegate Kessinger. Delegate Robinson. Delegate Fast. Delegate Fluharty. Delegate Overington. Delegate Byrd. Delegate Harshbarger. Delegate Fleischauer.
Here.
And Mr. Chairman.
Here. By the skin of our teeth, we have a quorum. Good morning. A couple of quick announcements. As you have learned from the memo that Staff Counsel sent out, we had subpoenaed a witness, Mrs. Lawfrey, to appear tomorrow. She's asked for some time to obtain an attorney. We've given her that time. We also have a rescheduling need on the tour that we had requested this week. So as a result of those two things and some other developments, we will not be meeting on Saturday. We should have a full day today. In fact, we'll probably go into the evening hours, and we've arranged to have dinner brought in somewhere between 5 and 5:30. So hopefully we can get most of our work done today, and we should have a relatively full day tomorrow, but we will not meet on Saturday. Counsel, are you ready to proceed? If you would, please call your first witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The House Committee on the Judiciary calls Steve Canterbury.
Mr. Canterbury, if you would, please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you shall give in the matter now before this committee shall be the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. Please be seated. One caution, Mr. Canterbury, before you begin. I had the opportunity to review the transcript of your testimony before the Judicial Investigation Commission. It's clear to me that the breadth and depth of your knowledge far exceeds mine, and that on some instances you got kind of carried away. So I'd ask you, in the interest of your time and our time, if you would please just focus on the question that's asked, provide your best answer, and if counsel or those who ask the question wish to get further information, I'm sure they'll follow up. Counsel?
Just leave it. It's fine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Canterbury, for the record, could you please state your full name?
Stephen Dane Canterbury.
Mr. Canterbury, it is my understanding, I believe, that you began working for the Supreme Court of Appeals of West Virginia in 2005. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did your employment end with the Supreme Court, I may now just call it the court, on January 4 of 2017?
Yes.
During that time period between 2005 and 2017, what position or positions did you hold at the court?
Administrative Director of the Courts of West Virginia.
That was the only position you held, and you held it the entire time?
Yes.
Could you please, to the best of your ability, just describe to the committee what your duties were as the Administrative Director?
To follow the directives of the court, to administer the various necessities for the judges throughout the state at every level, to institute programs as directed by the court, to to answer to the court as well as to the individual 5 justices.
How many employees answered to you, if you recall?
Well, at the administrative office, there were roughly 90 to 100. The administration of the various judges, they answered directly to the magistrates or the family court judges or the circuit judges, though I had some influence over their futures.
I believe you just stated this, but I want to make clear. As part of your job, did you work directly with the justices of the Supreme Court of Appeals?
Yes.
Mr. Canterbury, I would like, if we could, to go ahead and turn to an issue regarding state vehicles. And I want to ask you first just a few general questions. It is my understanding that at some point during your time with the court that there were questions that were raised regarding justices' use of state vehicles. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Do you recall when, and it could be by year if you know, or if you could give me an approximation, when that issue first came up?
Late winter or spring of 2016.
And at that time, again, just to the best of your recollection, what precipitated the issues regarding the state vehicles?
There was a lot of publicity regarding the state's cars generally, and Justice Davis asked about our cars, about how many we had, how they were used, how that worked.
And was that something that you were in charge of or had some responsibility of?
I was in charge of the person who was in charge of it. That was Arthur Angus, who was Director of Security. He also was in charge of the cars.
Let me, and I understand you said that the issues began being raised in 2016. At that time, did the court have a policy, and I'll begin with a written policy, on justices' use of state-owned vehicles?
No written policy. The policy was simply to follow the forms that had to be filled out through Mr. Angus.
I believe that the committee has had an opportunity to see that, and it's called an intranet form. Does that sound correct?
Yes.
Prior to 2016, and I understand you said that's when questions began to be raised, if you could just give the committee some idea as to how checking out of vehicles by justices worked between the 2005, when you began with the court, and 2016 time period.
If a justice needed a car, he or she would go to the office of Mr. Angus and would ask for a car, ask for the key, and at that time he would usually, I don't know if he always did that, he would ask where they were going and what the business purpose was. He would reserve the car or he'd hand them the keys.
With respect to that process, were you made aware between the 2005 and up to the time the issues were raised in 2016 of any issues that Mr. Angus had with respect to the justices, any justices, checking out a state-owned vehicle?
I don't think I heard anything specifically from Mr. Angus before 2016.
So in 2016, I understand that you have indicated that Justice Davis began to ask some questions, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But if I could please first ask you to refer to the first legislative audit report, and I did not mention this earlier. On the desk in front of you, you should have a white notebook with exhibits, and then also you should have 3 legislative auditor reports, and they are numbered in the top right-hand corner, 1, 2, and 3. So if you could please refer to the number 1 audit report on page 3 that mentions formal approval that was given regarding a car for Justice Ketchum. Do you recall that occurring?
When you say that occurring, that he was able to take the car for commuting purposes?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I know what happened with that. And
okay. If you can, and if you could just go back to the 2012 time period when that occurred, what happened at that time with respect to that vehicle?
Justice Ketchum, at the end of an administrative conference, asked if he could use the 2007 Buick, the silver Buick as we always called it, to commute, and the court said he could.
Before that time, to your knowledge, had any other justices used a state vehicle generally for commuting purposes?
No.
Since that time, in 2012, when Justice Ketchum began using that vehicle, were you aware of any other justices, our current justices now, that ever used a vehicle, generally speaking, for commuting purposes?
No.
With respect to the keys, I believe you might have mentioned this, that Mr. Angus had keys to the cars. Is that correct?
He did.
Did you have any keys to any of the cars as well?
Yes, I had keys to 2 of the Buicks.
And were you aware have you ever been made aware that any of the justices, current justices, ever had keys to any of the cars, their own set of keys?
I only know through testimony here. I didn't know before I heard during this, in the last 6 months or so. I didn't know when I worked there.
Okay, thank you. If you could please still refer to report number 1, now at page 41.
Okay.
It is my understanding that beginning on page 41, this is a memo from Mr. Branfus to you, I believe. Is that correct?
Correct.
If you could, please just tell the committee how the reason that this memo was prepared.
Well, there was a bit of consternation back and forth between Justice Davis and Justice Lawfrey. The other justices also were concerned. I thought we needed a legal opinion so that we would be able to understand what the issues were about use of the car, what the code said, and any tax consequences.
And is that the reason you asked Mr. Branfast to prepare this memo?
Yes.
If you could please refer now to page 47. I believe that is the last page of the memo. And if you could please, under possible consequences of improper use of state vehicles, if you could please just read to the committee what Mr. Branfast indicated as possible consequences.
Use of a state vehicle in a manner that contravenes the provisions of an applicable West Virginia legislative rule or an Internal Revenue Service, IRS, regulation could result in a determination that untaxed wages were accrued that must be reported to the IRS. Contravention of the relevant provisions of the Code of Judicial Conduct could result in the filing of an ethical violation complaint with the Judicial Investigations Commission.
Thank you. Did you, or if you know, did anyone else ever provide a copy of this memo to the justices in 2016?
Yes, I believe it was provided at the first administrative conference in the fall of early September 2016.
Do you recall any conversations during any administrative conferences about this particular memo?
I really don't recall anything specifically about the memo.
Okay. Other than the justices, if you recall, was anyone else at the court provided with a copy of this, of Mr. Branfast's memo dated July 21, 2016?
I don't recall if anyone else was provided with it. It would have perhaps been provided to a few people, but I can't say with certainty.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Canterbury, I'm now going to ask you to look in the white notebook, the exhibit notebook. If you could please look at exhibit number 2, which is hopefully at tab number 2.
Yes.
Could you please take a moment to review that document and familiarize yourself with it? Mr. Canterbury, this appears to be a memo from Justice Davis to you dated August 2, 2016. Do you recall receiving this memo from Justice Davis?
Yes.
If you could, please just provide the committee with your recollection as to what Justice Davis was requesting of you on August 2nd, 2016.
She wanted more specific information about how the court cars were being assigned, how they were being used, if there were any kind of IRS issues. She was concerned that perhaps there was some use of the vehicles that wasn't appropriate, and she wanted it on the administrative conference agenda. And it's a follow-up of her earlier questioning from several months earlier.
And her request was that these items be placed on the agenda for the upcoming administrative conference. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now I am going to ask you if you could please turn to the back of that notebook to exhibit number, what should be marked as exhibit 37. And if you could just please take a moment to look over that and familiarize or refamiliarize yourself with that.
Yes, I remember this.
If it appears that with respect to exhibit number 37, this is an email communication from Justice Lawfrey to you dated August 10, 2016. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that would have been approximately 8 days after Justice Davis sent her August 2nd email. Is that accurate?
Yes.
If you could, to the best of your ability, please just summarize and provide to the committee what your understanding of what Justice Lawfrey was asking of you in this email communication on August 10, 2016.
He asked about dinners that were held at Justice Davis's home when the judicial conference judges, circuit judges, were in Charleston at their conference, as well as about a cocktail party that she had, a dinner that she had in Wyoming when the Chief Justices of the nation had gathered in Jackson for their annual meeting.
Did Justice Lawfrey ask that these items be placed on the agenda or discussed at the upcoming administrative conference?
I don't recall if he asked that specifically, but they certainly were discussed in the conference.
And I'll get to that in just a moment. Now, if I could, and I'm just trying to go in time, if I could now please refer you to exhibit number 38.
There's 38.
And if you could please take a moment to review that document as well and refamiliarize yourself with it.
Okay.
Thank you. Let me ask you first, do you recall drafting this memo to the justices?
I do now, yes.
And if you could, again, I understand you've just had a moment to look at it, if you could just tell the committee the reason for this memo and what you were trying to relay to the justices in this August 19, 2016 memo.
Justice Lawfrey had asked that I look into the gatherings at Justice Davis's home and any other court employee's home where employees of the court had gathered. I had asked employees to my house on several occasions after about 2:30 for late lunch and to talk about generally some court administrative office business and then to enjoy themselves with the paths at my house and basically hang out. So that's in the memo. The other thing in the memo is a breakdown of all of the gatherings at Justice Davis's house. There were several, as noted in the exhibit, at her house. Only one had any of the food paid for by the court. Justice Lawfrey was very interested in his, I think, mistaken belief that all of these had been funded by the court. They had not. One had been partially funded, and I detail the funding in the memo, as well as at one other. There was transportation provided at the court expense, buses run from the hotel to her residence. There was one other gathering that was an appreciation dinner for employees. That was not the usual, which was just circuit judges and some couple of people from the court staff.
And also on the last page, I believe it's page 3, if you could please tell the committee what you did with respect to the inquiry regarding a dinner in Jackson, Wyoming.
Oh, that's right. Somehow that page got stuck. He demanded that I get in touch and get a letter from President of the National Center for State Courts, Mary McQueen, saying explicitly whether or not any of the National Center money had paid for any part of the dinner at her house in Jackson. Not a penny was paid for by anybody but Justice Davis, and that was clarified in the letter from Mary McQueen. The other thing was that I had forgotten that year, unusually, the first I think the only time in my entire time there we had an administrative conference at the end of August instead of the beginning of September.
Mr. Canterbury, I'm now going to ask you to refer back, please, to exhibit number 3 in the notebook.
Yes, I remember this memorandum.
And that was going to be my first question. It appears to be a memorandum from Justice Davis to Mr. Angus and Mr. Gundy and copies to other justices. Do you recall being made aware of it or seeing it during that time period in August of 2016?
Yes.
Okay. Did you speak with either Mr. Angus or Mr. Gundy with respect to this memo?
I don't think I did.
Now I'll ask you to please refer to exhibit number 4. And if you could please just take a moment to refamiliarize yourself with this memorandum.
Yes.
Thank you. The exhibit number 4 appears to be a memorandum from Justice Davis to you dated August 25, 2016. Do you recall receiving this memo?
Yes.
If you could, please just tell the committee what you recall about the request that was made or requests that were made in this memo.
She wanted to know specifically where some of the cars went with Justice Lawfrey, what the purpose was, what's the destination. There were a lot of blanks when she had reviewed what she had gotten previously. And she was asking that this specific information be provided. She also wanted to know why there had been no destinations listed. She wanted to know if there were court events on those days. She wanted to know if there were any other kinds of meetings, any other kind of court business. And she wanted to know if, in some of those dates, was the court not in recess.
And now I'm going to ask you to please refer to exhibit number 5. It appears to also be a memorandum from Justice Davis to you about 5 days later on August 30, 2016. And if you could, once you've had an opportunity to review that, just summarize for the committee what Justice Davis was requesting in that memo.
She said that she'd gotten some information, but there was still a great deal of information that was not provided with trips by Justice Lawfrey in the state car.
And finally, I think at least for now, if you could please now just refer to exhibit number 6.
Okay.
And take a moment to review that memorandum.
Okay.
Thank you. Do you recall receiving a copy of this memo in the August 2016 timeframe?
Yes.
And if you could please just summarize to the committee what Justice Lawfrey's position was at that time.
Well, there are a lot of issues he raises in this memorandum. He says that the issue was raised by Justice Davis as a distraction from her use of state money for a party at, as he calls it, at her house. that it was a fishing expedition, and that it was also to distract from payments to a contractor named Mark Starcher, and for the depletion, as he characterizes it, of the, he says, $26 million. And he said that there had been a number of requests for explanation. And frankly, erroneously, he says that they had never been responded to. He goes on to say that Justice Davis had used the car on numerous times, including, he says, to go to political events. He points out that there were a number of occasions where there was no destination for my use of the car, and a few indicate blanks for Justice Benjamin's use of the car, as well as Justice Workman's. He discusses that there's no written policy, that if there's going to be a written policy, that it should be comprehensive. He points out that using the car did not have to just be for court business. It could go to be speaking to high school civics classes, legal education programs, graduation ceremonies, etc. And he also points out that I would not know his schedule, nor would others outside of his office.
And Mr. Canterbury, now that we've gone through those various memos, it is my understanding from the dates of those memos that those memos were all going back and forth between the justices and yourself and perhaps Mr. Angus and Mr. Gundy, at least some of them, during the August 2016 timeframe. Is that correct?
Yes.
If you, and I think you mentioned this earlier, at some point was there an administrative conference either at the end of August of 2016 or the following month in September of 2016 where some of these issues that were mentioned in these memos that we have just recently discussed were actually discussed at the conference?
Yes.
Do you specifically recall whether or not that conference occurred in August or September?
I don't, but I read here that it said August 29th, and it did kind of tickle a memory that we were off to the races a little early that year.
If you could, please, let's just begin with the conference. And again, I understand you don't recall the specific date. Could you please tell the committee whether or not the use of state cars, and we'll just take them issue by issue, if the use of using state cars was discussed amongst the justices at that conference?
Yes.
What do you recall about those discussions?
It was a pretty... Well, it was an emotional discussion. The final conclusion was that, as I recall, it was a 3-2 vote, that justices were not to be asked why they were taking cars. The presumption was if they decided they needed a car, it must be for appropriate purposes.
You've just mentioned you recall that being a 3-2 vote. Do you recall which justice voted for not requiring a destination?
Justices Workman, Ketchum, and Lawfrey.
And with respect to the two justices that voted that a destination should be listed, which justices were those?
Justices Davis and Benjamin.
At some point, the committee, I believe, has received testimony that you may have instructed either Mr. Angus or Mr. Gundy, I don't recall, so I don't want to say for certain, that a destination was not required or that a justice did not have to give a destination when they made a reservation for a state-owned vehicle. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Does that come as a result of the conference you just described to the committee?
Yes, it was right afterwards. I literally walked out the door, and right outside the hall of the chambers of the justices is Arthur Angus's office. I went in, they both happened to be in there, and I told them that.
Okay. With respect to some of the questions about the vehicle use that may have not required destinations or did not include destinations before that meeting occurred, the questions Justice Davis had asked before, were those addressed during that administrative conference?
Yes, there was a lot of discussion about where he was taking the cars, and he said that it was all court business or something to that effect. He said that nothing was inappropriate.
Now let me ask you with respect to the dinners. I think they've been characterized as different things, but the dinners and the request for information about who paid for different dinners, was that discussed at the administrative conference?
Yes, it was.
If you could please summarize and tell the committee your recollection of those conversations, of that conversation rather.
The main point that I remember was that Justice Lawfrey really thought that the main point of impropriety was that there were invitations that were given to the judges that said that they were invited to a dinner at Justice Davis's home. And he said that because the court paid for it, it should have said that the court was providing a dinner at Justice Davis's home. He also felt that that it was inappropriate, I guess, that the court had paid any money for that dinner. The response was that it had also been in the agenda of the conference. It was listed on that, I think, Monday, the first day, or Tuesday, the first day of the conference. It was clear that it was part of the official business of the court. And it was also pointed out that had they not been going to dinner there, that they would have been paid a per diem for that dinner, which of course they didn't receive because they got a dinner without having to pay for it out of their pockets at Justice Davis's house.
There were some other questions raised in the various memos we've already discussed here this morning, including payments to a contractor. I believe you have indicated his name was Mark Starcher. Do you recall any conversations about that during the administrative conference?
Yes, I do.
If you could please summarize that conversation for the committee.
Justices Workman and Lawfrey just thought that there was something inappropriate about the payments over an 11-year period to a contractor, a technology contractor. And since Mark Starcher's name has been muddied so often in these various discussions, I will point out that Mark Starcher is an extraordinary person who does extraordinary work. And the court was not the only state contractor of Mr. Starcher through the years. The state police, West Liberty, I'd gotten to know him when I was at the Regional Jail Authority, and he did wonderful work. So naturally, I defended his work, said he was a scanning expert. In fact, he has a company named Scanmark, and that was what our preoccupation had been with the creation of a computer system that took all of that written material and turned it into a electronic platform. That he had earned his money and that it was not inappropriate.
Was Mr. Starcher still performing work for the court at the time that conference was going on, or had he already completed his contract?
Well, he had stopped working in around June of 2016 because the original issue was brought up, frankly, in November of 2015. There was a lot of discussion about it then. And so I let him know that for whatever reason that the court had become extremely agitated. A few members of the court had become agitated about his work. And however, he was still contracted to do work with at least one federal grant, perhaps two, and he was finishing that up. He also was involved with doing e-filing, scanning in a few circuits, and I thought it was wise to let him finish that up. It was all done, as I recall, by around June of 2016, perhaps July, perhaps May, but around then.
Thank you. There was also mention, I believe, in Exhibit Number 6, which was the memorandum from Justice Lawfrey to the four justices, Ketchum, Workman, Benjamin, and Benjamin, just to the three, rather, about the as he states, the depletion of the court's so-called rainy day fund in the amount of $26 million. Do you recall any conversations about that allegation during this administrative conference that we've just been talking about?
Yes, I once again attempted to explain that it was a mischaracterization to call it a depletion. And I once again pointed out that every single penny was accounted for, that every penny had gone through proper channels, and that I reminded them yet again that this had been a point of some contention with a couple of the leaders in the Senate primarily several years earlier. I don't know that I ever got through to a couple of them. I don't think I communicated very well about that, to be perfectly honest, but I did try. Ultimately, it resulted in a memorandum that you've probably seen a couple of months later as we went back and forth with conversation with Justice Workman especially.
Thank you, and we do have that. We'll get to that in just a little bit. I do appreciate that.
I'm sorry if I got the cart ahead of the horse.
No, that's fine. We will make it there. Do you recall, I know we've been over a couple of issues, do you recall any other issues that were discussed during that administrative conference that may have occurred near the end of August 2016 or perhaps in September 2016?
There was some routine business. I don't really recall. I mean, I could have my memory tickled if you're thinking of something in specifics, but I can't remember right now.
Thank you. Mr. Canterbury, I'm now going to turn to a new topic, and that is the topic of home office policies, or lack thereof. So that we're prepared, that's the new topic I'm going to move to. Let me ask you first, during your time with the court, from 2005 through 2017, do you remember any written policy that the court had regarding allowing the Supreme Court justices to have a home office?
No.
Did the justices, during the time period that you were with the court, did they have some type of computer equipment that they would take home, as you recall?
Yes.
What type of equipment do you recall generally being provided to the justices for their homes? Each
justice had a computer. When I first got there, they tended to be desktops, but as laptops got to be better, I guess, they tended to switch to laptops. So a few had laptops, a few had desktops. Only one had a printer, as I recall, before Justice Lawfrey, and that was Justice Ketchum. There was no policy about that. I think that this has been a topic of some scholarship, but as so often happens, technology outpaced policy. And it had I think that I'd heard that in the 1990s they had fax machines, and fax machines then developed into people having computers to stay in touch. There's been some question and consternation about why the court would provide computers. I don't know that people are quite understanding of the security that's necessary and to have a secure system. And that's why the security people and the IT division wanted them to have these dedicated computers.
Other than the computers and printers, before, let's say, 2013, were you aware of any other type of equipment that any justice took to his or her home for a home office?
No.
At some point after Justice Lawfrey was elected, did you have a conversation with him about a home office?
No.
Do you recall him, let me back up now and ask just about any furniture that might have been moved from the Capitol to Justice Lawfrey's home. Do you recall having any type of conversation with Justice Lawfrey about moving any furniture, be it a couch or a desk, to his home? And which piece of furniture do you recall having a conversation about?
The couch.
If you could, please tell the committee what you recall about that conversation.
Justice Lawfrey told me that he thought that he would take that couch home for his home office. And my reaction was frankly, was what? But I said, okay, and I always wanted to try to serve these guys, so I said, do you want me to help you arrange for its moving? And he said he would take care of it.
The couch that you are referring to, there has been mention of two different couches. One has been referred to as Justice Albright's couch. Is that the couch you were referring to?
That's the couch.
Did you, in the end, have any involvement in moving that couch from the Capitol to Justice Lawfrey's home?
No.
In fact, have you ever been personally yourself to Justice Lawfrey's home?
No.
Did Justice Lawfrey ever mention to you any plans or any talk about moving a desk to his home?
No.
During your time with the court, did you at some point become aware that Justice Lawfrey had a desk that had been moved from the Capitol to his home?
No.
Did you find out at a later time after your employment with the court ended?
Yes.
Also, at some point after your employment ended, did you become aware or did you read a statement that had been issued by Ms. Jennifer Bundy from the Supreme Court about the Supreme Court's, and I will paraphrase here, but the Supreme Court's long-standing policy or practice, rather, of providing the justices an opportunity to establish a home office?
Yes, I read that. It puzzled me.
Were you aware of any such policy or long-standing policy during your years with the court?
No.
There has been mention made at some point, and I can't say where just right now, but that Justice Workman may also have a chair at her home. Do you have any knowledge of that?
No.
So other than the computer equipment, including printers perhaps for two of the justices, and the couch, is that the only information you had about Supreme Court equipment going to the homes of the justices?
Yes, that's it.
Mr. Canterbury, I'd like to now move to a new topic, and the new topic is going to deal with office renovations.
Okay.
Let me ask first, generally speaking, if you know, did justices during your time with the court have an understanding or direct knowledge, rather, let's say direct knowledge of the amount, the cost to the renovations to their respective offices?
To their own offices, yes.
They did?
Yes.
We have received some information that renovations began occurring, I believe, perhaps even before the year 2010. Does that sound correct to you? And it would not have been to the justices' offices themselves.
Correct. It began in 2008 with the counsel's office.
If you could just please try to give the committee an overview of the renovation project, and I understand you just indicated it began in 2008. If you could provide to the committee just an overview of the areas where the renovations occurred beginning in 2008. Yes,
in 2008, a decision was made to gut the counsel's office, chief counsel's offices. That's where the RIC clerks and a few of the personal law clerks, and at that time something called a per curiam clerk, had offices. We actually had to move them to another location for several months. That project was bid out, and Neighbor Gall Construction won the bid. I don't remember exactly, but it was approximately $500,000 or so. The court was very pleased not only with the work of Neighbor Gall, they were very pleased with the fact that the project manager and the people they had on the job were very considerate of the people directly beneath them, i.e. the justices. That's the same end of the building. And so when we decided that we would do further work and completely gut out and reroute and rebuild the clerk's offices, we did so by change order. It's important to note that the court did not follow the purchasing procedure. In fact, we didn't even have to bid out the original contract, but it seemed unwise to me not to bid out the first construction. That project then went on for a while, and at that time, we started to do one justice's office at a time, beginning with Justice Benjamin's office, which was in great need of repair, having had virtually nothing done to it since the building was built. Slowly over the years, there was his office, then Justice Workman's, Justice Ketchum's. Justice McHugh wanted absolutely nothing done to his. As he said, I'm a short-termer, I don't need this done. So we held off, and then Justice Lawfrey just really was insistent that his be next, and so Justice Davis said, that's fine, let him go next. And then it ended in 14 with Justice Davis's office. During that time, there was also some work done in the hallway of the first floor on the east wing, just essentially cleaning the marble and putting in different LED lights. Since we had to take the fixtures down anyway, we thought we'd put in LEDs.
With respect to the bid process, I understand that from what you're just stated, that the Supreme Court did not have to bid out that original renovation work, but the court chose to do so. Do you recall if Nabergall was the lowest bidder?
Yes.
Okay. Do you recall how many bids were received at that time?
No. Okay. But there were a couple. The work was pretty slow in 2008, and I think there was a lot of interest. And this is a general question, I know you just went through several years of renovations in different areas. Did Nabergall do primarily most of those renovations, or were there other contractors? Again, Nabergall to the court was pretty much the project manager and the people they had on the job. The project manager moved to another construction company, so Justice Davis's office was not done by Nabergall. It was done by, I can't remember their name now. I've got an absolute blank. It begins with a G. I can't remember it. You probably have the information there.
I may. That's fine. But is that where the project manager had moved to?
Yes.
From Nabergall.
Right. We did continue with the same architects, Stilling Associates.
You have just mentioned Silling and Associates, and I'm going to go off topic just a little bit, but I just wanted to confirm the committee has received an affidavit from an employee of the court, Kim Ellis. Do you know Ms. Ellis?
Yes.
It is my understanding that Ms. Ellis was actually employed by Silling Associates before she came to the court. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Justice Workman and I and a few others were so impressed with her work that we wanted her hired, and Justice Workman was especially interested in making that happen, and she was one of the stars, frankly, of the administrative office.
Mr. Canterbury, I'd now like to focus on the renovations to Justice Lawfrey's office.
Yes.
Justice Lawfrey has previously indicated, I believe perhaps in an interview or in print, that he had very little input in the renovations in his office. Let me ask you first, do you agree with that statement?
No.
How involved, in your opinion, well, let me back up. Were you involved in the renovations to Justice Lawfrey's office?
Well, somewhat. I mean, Kim Ellis was the project manager. I delegated a lot in my job. It was a pretty big job, but I was probably a little more involved at Justice Lawfrey's insistence on a few specific items.
How, if you feel that you can you please tell the committee, in your opinion, how actually involved Justice Lawfrey was in the renovations to his office?
Daily, a couple of times daily, he would check in and ask questions and be very specific about his displeasure about some things, sometimes remarkable minutia. He wrote, I don't know how many email scores, perhaps hundreds of emails, and they were all around the clock. If you look at the emails, I think you'll find a few of them are midnight or 1 in the morning. He was very involved, and he was more involved than any other justice by a long shot.
Any other justice that you've ever worked with during your tenure with the court?
That's right.
If you know, was Justice Lawfrey aware of the renovation cost? And I'm going to confine this to the renovation costs to his office.
Yes, he received a direct email that was copied to me from the either Neighborgall or Silling. I'm not sure who provided the email, but it said exactly what the estimate was, what the cost would be.
There has been discussions and talk about a wood medallion that is in the floor of Justice Lawfrey's office. Are you aware of that wood medallion?
Oh, yes.
Could you please tell the committee how that idea came about?
Justice Lawfrey wanted it. He put it on a rendering that he sketched. Pretty good artist, actually. He sketched out exactly how he wanted his office to look, and he had the medallion there on the floor. He'd seen something like that somewhere, and he thought it was cool, and he wanted it on his floor.
And with respect to the counties that are in that medallion in the state map, are all of the counties distinct?
Yes, they are.
Whose idea was that?
It was his idea, but he wanted me to actualize it. I spent a long time looking through those woods. We have counties that border 6 other counties, and if you change the wood in one, it'd have to change the other. I spent a long time. That's why I said more than other offices. I got involved, and that's what I was thinking of. I'm the one who had to figure out where the woods went. It was one of the few times he actually said something nice to me in an email. He said I'd done a pretty good job, but that he disagreed with a couple of the wood choices. And I don't know if it was in the email or if it was in a conversation, but he decided he wanted Tucker County to be in the same blue pearl granite, I'll never forget that term, that he had on his little bathroom floor that he had redone. So the blue pearl granite was provided and cut and put into the slot for the Tucker County.
What type, if you recall, what types of wood were used in that medallion?
I don't. I mean, you know, there were various versions of oak, walnut. There were a couple of woods that were kind of different. Some sort of maybe African blackwood or something. There were just different shades of wood because this company was out of Wisconsin, as I recall. And they specialized in these kinds of projects, so they had the woods that they knew they could cut precisely, but also would be in high contrast to the other woods to be able to make the seal, the symbol, the map, whatever.
Now I want to ask you about a couch that was located in Justice Lawfrey's office.
Yes.
It has been referred to in many instances as a $32,000 couch. Are you familiar with that couch?
Yes, I am.
Did you ever personally discuss the cost of that couch with Justice Lawfrey?
Yes, I did.
Can you please tell the committee about that conversation, or conversations if there were more than one?
It was a brief conversation. It was the only thing I had to do with the couch, really. The project manager dealt with that. But I noticed as the document came across my desk that it was $32,000. Well, that seemed extreme to me, so I went up to find him. He was in the, I just happened to catch him in the hall, and I said, this couch is $32,000. Do you want me to go through with this? And I remember pretty specifically, and now in hindsight, it seems to be prophetic, but he said yes, and essentially he said, if it ever becomes public, I'll just blame it on you. You're the administrator.
And do you recall any other part of that conversation, or was that the end of the conversation?
I don't recall anything else. That kind of was it. He chuckled. His humor is interesting. It's kind of a insult humor, for lack of better words. He tends to go that route and has this interesting, self-satisfied chuckle when he's finished. So that kind of is that's pretty much told me, make it so. So I sent it on through.
And I'm now going to move off topic just a little bit, but with respect to the full price of that couch being approximately $32,000,
yes.
I believe there has been some discussion, and I'm not sure if I've read that or heard that on the news, about different spending limits that different persons or justices may have had at the court. Are you aware of any spending limits that were imposed at any time?
Yes. There was a spending limit on me and on the Chief Justice for individual items. However, once the court had said that they wanted something done like construction and there was even a document about technology that it was not necessary for me to have to go to them with everything that came in that project, because the project obviously was going to have some costs that exceeded that once they approved that was my go-ahead to be able to carry those things out and to submit those invoices for payment. The technology issue had become so, I guess, problematic in the early part of the 21st century. Before I got there, there was a memorandum to that effect. With the construction, they approved various constructions, and I then made it so. I made sure that those things happened. So there would not have been a limit on this. This would have been part of his office renovation, and everything would have been under that heading.
As I understand it, the office renovations, the original quote for the office renovations, did that generally include furnishings or no? Okay.
No furniture was included in that. I will point out about the couch, I had zero to do with the couch except for asking him that question. I know that he wanted a couch that was specifically large enough to fill a certain space. That made the couch get more expensive. But he, his wife, and his secretary, as I recall, went to the couch shop, carpet gallery, I think, and they picked out the fabric, and the fabric was the main cost of that couch.
What, if you know, why was that fabric so much more expensive than?
It was blue suede, and that was a couch not designed, I suspect, to be a leather-covered couch. The suede comes in hides, not in rolls. It's not like a wool blend, and you have to cut it, and you have to seam it, and it gets really expensive.
Other than the one conversation that you have just told the committee about in the hallway in which you mentioned the price of the couch to Justice Lawfrey, do you recall any other conversations that you had with Justice Lawfrey about the price of the couch?
No, that was the one and only moment I had with the couch.
Okay.
I've never even sat on the couch.
Okay. Mr. Canterbury, I'd like to now move to another topic regarding framing and costs associated with framing. Let me ask you first, during your time with the court, was there a policy regarding framing?
No.
How, if a justice, and I'm going to limit this line of questions now just to justices, but if a justice wanted to have something framed, what would a justice do, generally speaking, to have something framed?
Ask me to take care of it, typically, and I would either take care of it because they specifically wanted my input, or I would give it to the project manager to take care of.
Over over your time, rather, with the court, did all of the justices that you've worked with through the years request framing?
Not all. I don't recall Justices Albright, Starcher, or Maynard ever asking for anything to be framed. I don't know that Justice Davis ever asked for anything to be framed. I could be wrong, but I don't recall it. Justice Benjamin had a few things framed. Justice Lawfrey had a lot framed. Justice McHugh did absolutely nothing in that regard. Justice McHugh is one of the purest people I've ever met. I don't think he noticed the furniture in his office, to be perfectly honest. I think that, but Justice Lawfrey wanted a lot of things framed.
Let's talk about that for a moment. Now, if you could, to the best of your ability or recollection, go through to let us tell the committee what types of things Justice Lawfrey asked you to have framed.
Well, he had myriad things framed. I'll try to recall. They were all framed at the art store. So they will have records, I suspect, but and I know that some of those records have been sought by other groups. He had the swearing in, the big panoramic swearing in photograph framed, as I recall. But he had some more idiosyncratic things framed. He had a page of uncut $2 bills. That was his. He wanted that framed. He had some articles that were about his son in the commercial. His son Wanatelli, a good actor. He wanted those framed. They were framed. He had a poster of the front of his book, and he wanted that framed. He liked having these presentation frames. He had his first written opinion framed, and those were expensive because he wanted this gilt frame, and he wanted them to have the title page, the syllabus point page, and the signature page. Those are 3 cutouts, and he wanted fillets in those, and that added to the cost. Excuse me. And he also did the same thing for Justice Workman. He wanted that to be framed for some primary or essential case of hers, and so he did that and gave her, I guess, a gift of that frame. He also had that done for at least 1 and maybe 2, I don't really recall, of his law clerks. Those were the most expensive frames he did. He also had framed an etching of the building in which he was married. I never saw that on the wall of the court anywhere. And he had at the bottom of the stairs, when they had gotten married, there was apparently an Asian woman who did these little quick, very colorful watercolors of the new last name of the happy couple, and she had a little business at the bottom of the steps. They got one of those. It was a long thing, and he wanted that framed. I also never saw that again at the office. There could have been other things, but I don't know exactly the cost, but the framing total had to be in the $10,000 to $12,000.
You have mentioned, I want to just make sure I haven't missed anything, at least 2 items that you recall having framed that you don't recall seeing in Justice Lawfrey's office. Is that correct?
At least 2, right.
And if you could, again, just so that I make sure that I'm clear, what are those 2 items that you don't recall seeing in his office?
The etching of the large, old, beautiful government building where he was married in England, I believe, and then that rendering of his name in watercolors, very colorful.
The other frames that were not given away, I understand that you said some might have been given to law clerks and 1 may have been given to Justice Workman.
Correct.
Excluding those, the other items you recall having framed for Justice Lawfrey, do you recall seeing those in Justice Lawfrey's office?
Yes.
Do you recall where on the wall those were?
2 were on the wall that was to the side of the couch, and the others were above the couch. And I never went into his office after about May of 2014, so I'm not 100% sure exactly how they're placed, but I'm pretty sure that's where they were.
Mr. Canterbury, you just mentioned the time period of May of 2014, so I'm going to go ahead and transition there if that's okay. Let me begin by asking you if you could please describe your working relationship with Justice Lawfrey between the time he became a justice in 2013 and May of 2014.
The transformation in Justice Lawfrey's character from being a law clerk to a justice was, in a word, extraordinary. It was awkward interacting with him pretty early, because fairly early after he was elected, he told me something that just, I don't know where that came from, but he said that he knew that when he was Justice Maynard's law clerk, that I had advised Justice Maynard to fire him. Well, I never had. I've never advised anybody to fire anybody, I recall, but I certainly did not. I said, no, I think, I know that didn't happen. I don't know what Justice Maynard told you, but the only thing I suggested to Justice Maynard was that he might not want to write that note of praise for the back of Justice Lawfrey's book. I said, you know, Spike, you're going to have a lot of friends in that book, and you maybe don't want to write that piece. And I'll never forget what Justice Maynard said in his style. He said, well, I'd rather write the piece on the back of the book than be one of the subjects in the book. I said, okay. He wrote the piece. I never understood where he was coming from on that. And then there were occasional times when he would just be rather difficult. It's hard to describe, just a tone of difficulty. But I was pledged to serve him. I respect the office as much as any Boy Scout could respect anything, and I did everything I could to serve him. It truly soured, though, and it got very difficult in May of 2014. In May of 2014, before an administrative conference, he said that he wanted my resignation, which surprised me to no end. And everyone else in the room was surprised. And he said that he felt that I had disrespected him, that he had learned that I had told some judges that he was young and that he would learn more about drug court as time went on. I don't remember saying that, and I said as much then, and I did not resign. But from that moment on, he wouldn't speak to me, and in fact would sometimes refer to me in third person while I was in the room in the administrative conference. And if there were people around, he might say hello. He would send emails to me and want work done, and I don't think you'll ever find an email that was unanswered by me, and I took care of everything he wanted. I kept thinking I could bring him around, and I did inquire of some judges if they knew what the heck he was talking about, and nobody knew what he was talking about. They all referred back to Justice Ketchum, saying he's the only one they ever heard refer to his age, because he would say, "Here comes the boy Justice," in Justice Ketchum's style, and if you know him, you understand that. So I honestly have no idea what he was talking about, and I have really searched my heart, my head, to try to figure out what that was. I never understood it.
I believe you mentioned this earlier, and I do want to just confirm, after that issue or that incident in May of 2014, did you ever go back in Justice Lawfrey's office for any reason that you recall?
No, I was not invited. I mean, he literally would not. He talked to others and talked right through me. It was as if I didn't exist.
During administrative conferences from that time period forward, May of 2014 forward, did Justice Lawfrey speak to you directly in any of the administrative conferences?
I don't recall that he did. He tended to talk to the room if he needed to address something that I'd brought up, but he wouldn't address me, and in fact would sometimes refer to me in third person. He may have said some things to me, but it was not typical, and I kept trying to win him over. I kept thinking that I could, but I failed. Somebody asked if I had any preparation for that kind of treatment, and I said, well, I went to junior high like everybody else, because that's the only thing I
Canterbury,
can
you're getting
compare it
beyond
to.
the question now.
Sorry.
Counsel, next question.
Sure. Mr. Canterbury, you had mentioned per curiam clerks earlier in your testimony, and I'd like to go back to that. Was there at some point during your time with the court a change with respect to the types of clerks the justices had?
Yes.
If you could please explain the change. Let's just start with the change, and then we'll go to the reason for the change next.
Yes, there had been 2 per curiam clerks and 2 personal clerks. They changed to eliminate the per curiam distinction and had 4 personal clerks.
Do you recall approximately, and I'll take whatever you have, if you recall by year or any time period in which that change occurred?
Yes, it happened in 2013 within the first half of the year.
Do you recall what the reason was that precipitated the change from 2 per curiam and 2 personal to 4 personal clerks?
Justice Lawfrey introduced the subject and wanted the per curiam distinction changed.
Did he give a reason for why he wanted the per curiam distinction changed?
The per curiam clerks were hired by the court. The personal clerks were hired by the individual justice. He wanted to have control over hiring all 4 of his individual clerks instead of having 2 of them having to have the approval of the justices. Every justice at that time inherited 2 per curiam clerks. He had inherited 2.
And just so that I'm clear on that, when a justice would come on, that justice inherited their 2 per curiams. Is that correct?
Correct.
And was that change made?
Yes.
Do you recall, was that a vote of the court at that time?
Yes.
Do you happen to recall what that vote was?
No, you'd have to look at the administrative conference minutes. I don't recall.
Okay. I apologize, I'm now bouncing around. When you'll say something, it makes me think of another question. We have spoken at length here this morning about administrative conferences. Can you tell the committee, generally speaking, during your time with the court, how administrative conferences were scheduled, how often they would generally occur, if there was any type of set schedule with administrative conferences?
No, there was not. It was up to the Chief Justice, some scheduled more, some less.
Were they generally every month, every other month, or any type of pattern in that regard, or no?
No.
No. Okay. At some point, during some of these conferences, there has been, I believe, some discussion or talk about lunches that were provided to some justices and perhaps court personnel during some of those conferences, or on certain days the court was there. Do you have any knowledge as to the lunch issue?
Yes.
Let's begin with, if you recall, when did the lunches begin?
It was either 2011 or 2012. It had been a long and hard day. They still had an administrative conference to do work. They were wanting to get the day finished. They said, let's just order lunch and have the administrative conference during lunch.
Okay. And after that one time, did that become a pattern or a practice at the court?
Well, it wasn't every administrative conference, but it happened with some frequency. And then there were lunches when I wasn't around that they had for their opinion conferences, or with other gatherings when they were there without me.
Okay. And I'm not going to ask you with respect to any specific conference, but or any specific lunch, but in any of the lunches in which you were involved, how many people were involved in those lunches? If you can, just give an average.
12.
Okay. What types of...
14. I just thought of two others.
Okay. What positions or who were those 14 people?
The justices would get them for themselves, their assistants, for a while for both security people. Ultimately, I think Arthur Angus didn't want lunch anymore. And ultimately, Justice Davis chose not to get lunches anymore. And I got lunches at times until about 2015, and then I was excluded.
And was there ever any discussion as to why you were excluded from the lunches beginning in the 2015 time period?
Yeah, 15 or 16, somewhere in there. No. I was never, when they ordered lunch, they didn't call me.
Were you actually in there in the administrative conferences with them when they were eating the lunches?
Yes.
But you weren't given lunch?
No.
Was everyone else in the room given lunch?
Yeah, well, except Justice Davis would bring her own lunch in 16 and 15. She stopped having many, if any, lunches. I don't know about the others, but in administrative conference she did.
Do you know how those lunches were paid for?
Yes, they were paid for by the court.
Was it a P card used, a purchasing card?
Yes, sure, a P card was used.
Okay.
Right, the runner would use a P card. And all of their names were listed. Everyone who got a lunch has to be listed for the auditor to go through payment.
Were you ever questioned about that, about what names needed to be included?
Justice Lawfrey was surprised when he learned that all names were included. It was about another matter. He was concerned that we were having lunches for people we were training for UJA and people who came in from around the state for probation meetings, and to keep them there, and we'd provide lunches. And he said, you don't even know who's eating those lunches. I said, au contraire, everybody's name has to be listed or it doesn't go through the auditor's office. He said, well, does that include our lunches? And I said, well, sure, of course.
Okay. And did he indicate whether or not he was aware of that before that time?
I got the distinct impression he had no idea until that moment.
At the time your employment with the court ended in January of 2017, do you know, and this would have been through the end of 2016, do you know if those lunches were still occurring?
They occurred through 16. After that, I can't say, except what I've read in the paper.
Do you you recall any, and I'm not going to ask for an exhaustive list, but if you recall any of the restaurants where these lunches came from, if you could please tell the committee.
I may get this name wrong, but it's the South Hills Market and Cafe, I think is what it's called. Soho's. I think they also got some lunches from Panera's. But they liked South Hills. That seemed to be the go-to place.
Was there ever any discussion as to the costs of those meals in your presence?
No.
Mr. Canterbury, I'm going to back up now. You've indicated, or testified rather, that you had a conversation with Justice Lawfrey about that $32,000 couch, just about the price of it, and
Right.
On one occasion. Do you recall throughout your time with the court ever having a similar conversation, perhaps not about a couch, but about any other purchase that caused you any concern?
Yes.
And if you could, please tell the committee about that.
Justice Davis's chair said it was an awfully expensive chair. And then the next year, and those were the last, I think the very last thing that was done was actually in 2015 with those rugs. They were very expensive as well. And I said they were very expensive, the Edward Fields rugs.
In Justice Davis's office?
Yeah, I'm sorry, in Justice Davis's office, yes.
Other than those conversations, do you recall any other conversations that you've had with any justice about prices for specific items?
Well, the floor in Justice Workman's office, we had a discussion about that.
If you could, please tell the committee about that discussion, at least what you recall.
Just it was an extremely expensive floor, but she said that since she was doing so little else in the office, she was essentially just going to get some repainting, and she was leaving the wainscoting that was there for that she inherited, that she felt it was all right.
Do you happen to recall the price for that floor?
No, I don't. You can look it up. It's all, everything is available.
Right. Mr. Canterbury, I'd like to now move to talking about reimbursement expenses for out-of-town travel for justices.
Yes.
And let me ask you just generally, if you could let the committee know if a justice had made a decision that he or she was going to go to some type of conference that was out of state, how did they have to request approval, or what was the process for getting a justice approved for such travel and then reimbursed for such travel?
Well, they approved themselves. They're the boss. They're in charge. There was no vote of the court or anything. If a justice wanted to go somewhere, he or she went somewhere. As far as the costs, well, as much as possible, justices, I guess, generally would have direct payment from the court for airfare and even hotels. But often, of course, the hotels especially wouldn't take such direct approval. They would use their credit card, and then they would get reimbursed.
Just to back up, with respect to any conferences that a justice would decide that he or she may want to go to, did you indicate that that was just something that a justice would decide on his or her own, that was not additional court approval was not required?
Yes, I mean, I didn't even know sometimes when justice would go to a certain conference or another meeting.
Okay. And if you'll give me 1 moment. Mr. Canterbury, there has been in some prior legislative audit reports some discussion about Justice Lawfrey's use of vehicles and then use of rental vehicles when
Yes.
he had gone to out-of-state conferences. Let me ask you first, just generally, at the time those were occurring, were you aware that that was happening?
Generally, yes, not the specifics.
Okay. And was it uncommon for justices to get or rent vehicles when they were out of state attending conferences?
Not uncommon. They didn't all do so, but it wasn't uncommon.
Okay. When the reimbursements for the cars, the rental cars, and let's just focus now on the rental cars. When the reimbursement requests were made for the rental cars, were those reviewed by anyone before they were paid?
Well, they'd go through the fiscal division who would review them, I suppose. That was what they were supposed to do, but then they would be paid, and anything that a justice submitted pretty much was paid without question.
I've seen a note of an individual named Sue Racer Troy. Would that have
Yes.
been her division?
Yes.
Okay. Are you aware of, one way or the other, of whether or not any of the current Supreme Court justices would use rental cars and take personal trips while they were perhaps at a conference?
Yes.
If you could, please tell the committee about what you know.
Well, what I know is that Justice Lawfrey would take additional time or would skip parts of the conference and go to, I guess, personal trips. I don't know where he went, except on one occasion. I know he went to the Lincoln, Nebraska Capitol at a conference that was held in Omaha. I believe that he also went to parts of Yellowstone when the conference was in Jackson, Wyoming. Otherwise, what I know is only what's been reported.
Let's go back to the Nebraska trip. How did you become aware of that Justice Lawfrey would have taken the rental car to the state capitol there?
Well, I saw him leaving when the conference had just ended. He was on his way out in the car, and then later when we were talking about actually security at the Capitol, pointed out that, when he went to Nebraska, didn't he go to the Capitol and see that they had no security whatsoever? You could go in any of the doors. And he said yes. So that's how I know that when he left that day and got on that interstate, I just happened to be driving behind him, that he was on his way to Lincoln. I didn't have a rental car in Omaha. So.
Did you attend the same conference?
Yes.
You have indicated just previously that you believe there were times that Justice Lawfrey didn't go to the entire conference. How do you have that type of information?
In Asheville, North Carolina, there was a conference, and he had gotten special permission to be able to stay through till Friday night. The conference ended Friday midday, and it was a difficult discussion with the manager of the hotel because the rates only applied through Thursday, this special deal. He got, though, that deal to go through Friday. On Friday, I went to every event of the conference, as did Menace Ketchum. We couldn't find Justice Lawfrey anywhere.
And what, if you can, just please elaborate on you indicated that it was a little bit difficult. What did you have to do with respect to Justice Lawfrey's room or for his accommodations in North Carolina at that time?
Well, the assistant, I always made a point when I attended conferences with the justices of telling the assistant manager at the desk that if there was anything that came up that they needed any kind of additional help or whatever with the justices, just let me know and I would try to make it work out. And I got involved in the discussion when they called and said that he wanted this special rate, and I then called the State Court Administrator of North Carolina to see if he could assist, and through all of these efforts, Justice Lawfrey got the special rate. I don't know that Justice Lawfrey's even aware that any of that happened behind the scenes.
Okay. Mr. Canterbury, I'm now going to move to your use of the rental cars, and I just have a question about that. It is my understanding that when you would go on trips such as this and have rental cars, do I understand correctly that you would, when you returned, prorate your use of the car if there had been any type of what you believe to be personal use, you would prorate that upon your return? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. To your knowledge, did any of the current justices ever do any type of similar proration for any of their out-of-state trips?
No.
Do you have any information about whether or not any justice's spouse attended these out-of-state, and let's now focus just on Justice Lawfrey so that I can be clear about my questions, whether or not Justice Lawfrey's family, any family member attended these out-of-state conferences with him?
Yes, his wife and son.
Was that generally the case?
Yes.
Do you know whether or not there was ever, whether the court paid ever made any payment for any expenses related to Justice Lawfrey's daughter, or I'm sorry, son or wife for any, with respect to any of those trips?
Not that I'm aware of.
Do you recall ever having a conversation with Justice Lawfrey about that, though? About whether or not his spouse should be allowed to go with him?
Sure. It was encouraged by the National Center for State Courts for Spouses. They even have a special spouse organization, so it was encouraged. I don't remember a conversation, but I likely said, look, this is encouraged, and there are special spouse events and even children's events.
Do you recall ever having a conversation similar to that in which Justice Lawfrey indicated whether or not he felt that he should have to pay for his wife to attend the conferences?
Well, Justice Lawfrey once told me that he felt that he was, one of the people who was head of the judicial branch, and he said our spouses should be considered a lot like the First Lady of the governor, and the First Lady of the governor gets things paid for by the state, so why shouldn't the spouses of the justices? And I said, well, it doesn't work like that. See if the justices will agree with that, but he never brought it up in my presence with the others.
Mr. Canterbury, as part of your duties and as the administrative director, did you have any involvement in the management of the P cards that were used by the court employees?
Not specifically. I never had a P card myself. It was done through the fiscal division, and they had a person or two who was the specialist for the P cards.
And just to be clear again, is that Ms. Troy's area?
Right, that's Sue Racer Troy's area.
Okay.
Right.
Mr. Canterbury, I'm now going to ask that you please refer to the report labeled number 3 in the right-hand corner, please. Prior to today, have you ever reviewed this report for any reason?
I have seen this report.
Appendix C, which begins on page 13, I believe, of this report, appears to be a memorandum from you to all of the justices. Is that correct?
Yes.
I believe earlier in your testimony you mentioned a memorandum. Is this the memorandum that you were referring to earlier?
That's it.
Okay. Did you prepare this memo?
Yes.
If you can, please tell the committee what prompted you to prepare this particular memorandum.
Justice Workman asked me to prepare it. She wanted it to be in general terms.
And what did she, I believe you state, and let me just read this at the last sentence in paragraph 1, it states, in brief, she wants to know where the money went. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what money did she was she asking about?
She was alarmed that that what she termed the rainy day fund, which is a term I never used, at the end of 2011, which was roughly $29 million, had been reduced by 2014 to some $300,000. Or maybe it was 2015 to about $300,000.
I believe that you state in the first sentence in paragraph number 3 that Sue Troy's files will or do account for where all of that money was spent. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did you personally look through all of Ms. Troy's electronic files to confirm that, or were you just told that by Ms. Troy?
Told that by Ms. Troy. I didn't go through all the files.
Okay. But Ms. Troy has indicated to you that her documentation would show where all of that money went?
Yes, this memo was prepared with her assistance.
Okay. In the second paragraph of this memo, you do mention a constitutional amendment and some anger that had led to discussions among legislators about a constitutional amendment. Can you please just describe that and why you included this in the memo to the justices back in 2016?
Well, Senators Prezioso and Unger were just livid about the huge amount of carryover money in 2011. And it was a topic that frequently came up about the threat of a constitutional amendment. Ironic that that seems now. They wanted to make sure that we didn't create a problem there. And so the general thought was that we should bring down this carryover amount. And we did.
And when you say they...
Oh, the justices.
Okay. Were there discussions amongst the justices in which you were present, in which the possibility of a constitutional amendment in relation to this surplus funds or this amount, this $29 million, was discussed?
Yes.
If you can, please tell the committee about those conversations. And first, let me ask you, did all of the conversations you recall occur in administrative conferences or at different times?
Both.
Okay. Let's start, if you can, with the earliest conversations that you recall having with the justices about this constitutional amendment and this $29 million, or 28, whatever the case
right.
may be.
Well, it was a topic that came up with some frequency generally, but it came to a head when there was this rather difficult presentation to the Senate Finance Committee in 2011.
And who did that presentation in 2011, if you recall?
I don't recall if it was a justice, but I was involved in the discussion.
And you indicate that it was a difficult presentation. What happened that made
Well, a couple of the senators were just very upset. There was such a huge rollover amount that there was just this excess funds that were in the court, and they wanted to know why and what the point was, and I did my best to explain it.
And after that occurred in 2011, that presentation in the Senate in 2011, please describe for the committee any conversations that you were a part of with the justices discussing that possibility of a constitutional amendment and what should be done with that $28 or $29 million.
Well, they approved the budget in June. We always were putting the budgets together roughly 16 months before they were actualized. And so there was obvious discussion about making sure that certain senators were not going to be so unhappy as to pursue this. Generally, I don't remember anything more specific than just generally don't let it happen.
Don't let what happen?
Oh, the amendment turn into a bill and be presented to the people. They did not want that to happen.
When you say they did not want
The justices did not want that to happen.
At the time, I think we're talking about the 2011 time period, was that all of the justices, or do you recall any justice not having that same opinion?
Well, I think they all had the opinion they didn't want the amendment. Some justices paid keener attention to budgetary discussions than others, but I think they all were of a mind they did not want that to happen, the amendment to be passed by the legislature.
At some point during those discussions, was the topic of this excess money, what some people have termed surplus funds or the rainy day funds, the $28 or $29 million, was it discussed?
Was it discussed about, I'm sorry, I didn't quite.
I'm sorry, my question might not have been clear. Was it discussed in the context of what the court would do with that money?
No, they didn't. It was pretty clear why we had that surplus. It was because we had been optimistic, or I'd been optimistic, frankly, that we would be further along with the building of the unified magistrate system referred to as UJA, and we simply weren't far enough in time to spend down a lot of that money. So it was pretty clear that over the next few years, certain monies would be spent because they had approved the UJA and they'd approved ultimately e-filing, but at that time there was no discussion of e-filing. It was about UJA. And then there was also the knowledge that we would be digesting any kind of raise that happened, and they were very hopeful that there would be a raise for the judges, justices, et cetera. And they knew that that would be absorbed by that surplus, as it was. They also discussed giving money back to the General Revenue Fund, which was done as well.
And that was done, is that correct?
Yes, one time $2 million, and a few years later $4 million, so $6 million of it was just given back to General Revenue.
With respect to, and we'll stay on the first page of your memo on page 13, I believe in the third paragraph you note that the court had approved each of the appropriation requests with the understanding of the major issues, and then you note and expenditures, but the major issues that the court was facing. What did you mean? What type of major issues did you believe the court was facing when the court was approving the appropriation requests?
Well, there was the threat of the constitutional amendment. That was an issue. But there was also the issues of mandated drug courts and the computer system, those kinds of things. But I think I was focusing on that, on the constitutional amendment.
I believe that also in that same paragraph, in paragraph 3 on page 1 of your memo, you do mention that during this same time that the state was facing greater and greater shortages. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
And the court was aware of that?
Yes, and I think that's one reason why the Senate was so livid.
Was there... I'm sorry. At any time during this period, are you aware that the executive ever made any type of request, either oral or in writing, for the Supreme Court to make some type of budget cuts? Do you recall that ever being requested of the court?
No, I only remember them requesting that some money be given back to the General Revenue Fund.
Do you recall who made that request?
I do not. It was someone in the executive branch. I'm not sure who it was.
With respect to this money, and I understand you indicated that you worked with Sue Troy on this and that she does have all the documentation. Did some of this money, the $28 or $29 million, was some of it spent on the renovations?
Oh, yes. Yes.
And I didn't ask this before, so now I am going to back up. Could you please tell the committee about the Capitol Building Commission first, and any involvement that you might have had in the Capitol Building Commission over the years?
Yes, I was the person appointed by the court to the Capitol Building Commission. I was a non-voting member.
How long were you on that commission?
Gosh, years and years. I don't even remember when it started, but I was on it at least 8, 10 years. I don't know. Long time.
And what does the Capitol Building Commission do, if you could just let the committee know generally?
It reviews any changes that are proposed by any person involved with government to the Capitol campus to make sure that they're in keeping with the Cass-Gilbert vision and other historical, niceties of the campus. There is an office of historical protection run by Dr. Pierce. Everything had to be reviewed by her, and then there were recommendations made to the Capitol Building Commission. I was kind of known as a fierce member of the Capitol Building Commission.
Let me ask you this, with respect to the renovations that were done by the Supreme Court. I think you indicated they began in 2008 and may have gone through 2014 or 15. Did those renovations have to be approved by the Capitol Building Commission, any of those?
Most all of them were in private space, and the private space is not under their purview. The lights in the and the cleaning of the marble in the hallway on the first floor, there was a discussion with Capitol Building Commission about that, and with Dr. Pierce. And I guess the lobby of the lobby and the bathrooms, the lobby of the clerk's office and the bathrooms. There was discussion with them about that.
But not the actual offices?
No, they don't have any authority over private offices. Okay. I mean, if the governor in his office or any legislator in their private office want to make it look a certain way, they can make it look any way they want.
Mr. Canterbury, I'm now going to ask you to stay, please, on report number 3, but please refer back to page number 1 of report number 3. And if you could please, certainly feel free to read the first paragraph as well, but I'm going to ask you a question about the second paragraph. If you could please take a moment to review the second paragraph.
Yes.
Mr. Canterbury, it's my understanding from I believe in the second sentence of that paragraph, the second paragraph, that Chief Justice Workman in the May of 2018 post-audit subcommittee meeting indicated or responded that she nor any of the justices had discussed the need to spin the balance down to avoid sponsorship of a constitutional amendment. Do you agree or disagree with that statement?
I disagree. No, I agree she said it, but I disagree with what she said.
I'm sorry, my question wasn't clear.
I thought that's what you meant.
Yes. And for what reason do you disagree with this statement made by Justice Workman?
It was a frequent topic of conversation about the constitutional amendment, and it was pretty well known that we were not requesting enough money to keep up a $29 million rollover amount from one budget year to the next. And so I don't know how she missed the conversation, but I will note that she didn't write a memo in response when I sent the memo out, and she didn't hesitate to correct me when I was wrong.
Mr. Canterbury, I'd now like to move back to some of the duties that you had as the administrative director. As part of your duties, were you in charge of personnel decisions such as sometimes hiring or keeping on or letting go of certain employees?
While I was there, the process was this. Anyone who was hired to a permanent position in the court, administrative office, or in the other offices at the Capitol had to be approved with the vote of at least 3 of the justices. However, when I arrived in 2005 and until I left, the firing was on me and me alone. The justices wanted distance. They did not want to be involved in the firing. I, of course, would notify them when somebody was fired, but it was on me to do that. Oh, and one last thing. The hiring of temporary personnel did not go through the court. That was on me.
During your time with the court and during your employment, were you ever asked by any justice to hire specific employees?
Yes, I was.
If you could please tell the committee which, if there were more than one, which justice made such request of you?
Only Justice Workman ever asked me to hire anyone.
Do you recall the number of times that Justice Workman would request that you hire someone?
Yes, there were 4, although one of those has an asterisk because I'd already talked to that person and had decided I wanted to hire her without the Justice Workman even knowing I'd had that conversation. That was just a happy coincidence.
And with respect to that, I think you've just indicated there were 4. Were those all 4 the requests for them to be permanent employees of the court or contract employees?
3 were permanent, 1 was contract.
When these requests were made by Justice Workman, how did you respond? Just generally, and then we can get into the 4 instances, but typically, what was your response?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, let's begin with the contract employee. I believe you indicated there was only 1 contract employee.
Yes.
If you could please tell the committee about the request that was made and the employee that you then later retained.
What was John Pritt was the contracted person. She said that he was a technical whiz, that he had worked for her as a volunteer setting up her website during the campaign, as I recall, and she felt that he would be of great assistance to the court.
And do you recall any other conversations that you had with Justice Workman about that hire before he was hired on?
Before he was hired?
Yes.
No,
yes.
I don't recall anything else with her.
Did you hire him as a contract worker?
He was contracted, yes, he was.
And where did Mr. Pritt work? What type of work did he do in what department?
Initially, he was in the technology division working with Scott Harvey. Scott came to me after a few months and said his expertise does not fit with what we are doing here. We don't really need him. So I said, well, try him. He had a couple of suggestions that maybe he could try him in a few other places. I said, let's try that. Get back to me. He got back to me and said, it's not working out. So I went to Justice Workman and said so. She said that she thought that I should try to figure out a way to make it work. At that point, Scott Harvey had the idea that since Oasis was starting, that perhaps Sue Troy could use him as the Oasis person. To the meetings, the initial meetings for Oasis, and he did that for a while, and then Mr. Pritt quit.
Do you have any recollection as to the amount of money that Mr. Pritt was paid during his time with the court?
I have a general recollection that in that year and a half or so, he received around $160-some thousand.
Now I would like to move to the requests that were made of you with respect to the permanent employees. It's my understanding from your testimony that there were 3 such requests.
Yes.
Okay. If you could just go, let's begin with the first one that you recall. Who was the first person as a permanent employee that Justice Workman requested that you hire?
It was D. Hill as a receptionist and as a person who would be kind of a fill-in for secretarial duties as needed.
Were you looking for a receptionist and secretary at that time?
No, but we did need a person somewhere else, so we moved one of the person that Dee filled in, we moved that person to the other job.
And what job was Ms. Hill given?
Kind of I think we called her the floater. She filled in when the receptionist would take breaks and would then also do other jobs as came up, kind of being the administrative assistant for things.
And was Ms. Hill qualified for those jobs?
Yes, absolutely, and she's a wonderful person.
Was Ms. Hill still employed at the court when your employment ended in 2017?
Yes.
Now if we can move to the next person that you recall being requested to hire.
I don't remember her first name, but her last name is Miller, and she also was an administrative assistant. And at that time, there had been a request by the Director of Judicial Education for some assistance beyond what she had, and so when she asked me to find a place for her, that was the place that seemed to make sense. And I will point out, the court approved all of these. All the hires were approved by the court.
By the court as a whole?
The entire court, yes.
And again, I'm sorry, I may have just missed this. Did you indicate that Ms. Miller was hired as an administrative assistant?
Yes. In the Division of Judicial Education. And she was supremely qualified.
Okay.
And she did a great job.
Was there, I'm sorry, that was the second. Who is the third person that you recall the request being made to hire?
Well, that one was always kind of an interesting little private joke, and this may be the first time that Justice Workman learns of this, but I had a relationship with Janie Moore that stretched back to my days at the regional jails. She was the first magistrate to be the guinea pig on the remote arraignment, and I had a marvelous relationship with her. I knew that the Director of Magistrate Services was not working out, and I called her and asked her if she would do that job. She said that she would have to finish the campaign. She was working as a campaign person for Justice Workman, and then candidate Workman, and but that if it's still open, that she would be interested. It was, and I hired her. But Justice Workman had also asked me to hire her. Janie Moore knows more about magistrate courts than anybody in the world. She is extraordinarily good, and I would not want any of this to be considered a slight of her, because she is simply amazing.
And you had actually approached Ms. Moore before.
Right, but I didn't bother to share that with Justice Workman when she talked to me. I figured that if she didn't ask, I wasn't telling. Now she knows.
At any time during your employment with the court, did you speak with Justice Workman about your plans to, or your belief that an employee, not one that you've already previously mentioned, but that an employee might need to be terminated?
Yes.
And if you could please tell the committee what Justice Workman's response was to your discussion about your belief someone needed to be terminated.
Her response, this was before she actually had, it was after her election, but before she had gone into office, and I knew that this employee had a relationship with her, and so I told her that I was thinking of firing her because she just wasn't getting the job done, and she wasn't showing up as much as she should. And she exhausted many sick days and others, annual days. And Justice Workman was not pleased at that thought. She liked her very much. And she said that, as I recall, she said, new justices frequently look for new administrators. So it was a bit of a threat. And I said, if you feel that strongly about her, we'll keep trying to make her work out, and we'll keep trying to use the positive approach that I've used all along. And that was always my approach to employees that were failing, was to try to get them to do better. I don't want to get too far off topic here, but that was it.
I appreciate that. Any other employees that we have not already discussed that Justice Workman requested that you hire at the court?
I'm not recalling any. Those were the ones I recall.
With respect, and we've been discussing Justice Workman at this point, let me now ask you a question. Did Justice Workman ever make requests of you that were not work-related?
Yes.
If you could, please tell the committee members about those types of requests that were made of you on personal matters.
Well, they were personal things having to do with her or her family, and I did my best for her. And mistakenly, I thought that we had a friendship. I guess I played the fool on that. But I don't feel comfortable getting into the details of what those personal things were. As angry as I am with her right now, I'll take those things to my grave.
When you say personal, do you mean actually personal that had nothing to do with the court?
Yes.
Were they requests that were made during work hours at the court or after work hours?
Oh, both. She would call me in the evenings, but often she'd call me in the evenings for work things. So, I was on the clock 24 hours a day. We had early rising justices, we had late justices, and I was ready to answer the phone at 6 with some and at 2 in the morning with others.
I believe you mentioned this earlier, and I want to just confirm. With respect to the request for hiring individuals, did you indicate that Justice Workman was the only person that you recall making such requests?
Yes, I don't recall anybody else asking to hire anybody. There was one contractor asked by one justice, but no other hires.
You just mentioned that, and let me follow up on that just a little bit. With respect to the contractors that might have performed work during renovations, such as interior designers or...
Oh, well, that's true, yeah.
Were those special requests, or let's not call them requests, by the actual justices as well?
I'd forgotten that Justice Workman was very keen on our using designs by Fisher for her cabinet work, and also when there was a renovation to create a little kitchenette to the side of the conference room, that she wanted him to get that work. And he's very good, so it didn't seem to be a problem. And so I followed that. She did make that request. I'd totally forgotten about that. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. And I have the same question with respect to other justices. During the course of their renovation, I understand there was a general contractor, often Neighborgall, but were there other contractors that were hired
Subs,
in?
Yeah.
Okay. Were any of those at the request of the specific justice for his or her office?
Justice Ketchum had specific requests for the people who did his wainscoting and his flooring. He had, they were from the Huntington area, and he's very jingoistic about Huntington, and he wanted them hired. And so they were contracted. Their prices were as good if they were competitive, so it seemed to make sense.
With respect, I understand you indicated that early on, back in the 2008 or whatever that time period was when the renovations began, that
Yes.
was put out to bid. Were any other, while you were with the court, any other contracts like that with respect to, let's begin with renovations, any other type of renovations, were they ever put out to bid?
No, after the initial bid, that was it.
And what about any other contracts, let's say for IT, technology type things? Were any of those ever put out to bid?
The initial UJA software provider was competitive, it wasn't a bid, it was a request for projects, but it was a competitive request for projects. We also bid out at least once, probably twice, the drug screening people, the urinalysis folks. Court spends a fortune on that, and I thought we'd maybe get a better price. It turns out that the vendor we had won each time.
Okay. Any other bids that you recall during your time with the court that were any type of project or renovation that was put out to bid that we haven't already discussed here this morning?
I can't think of any. There may have been, but I don't recall.
Mr. Canterbury, I'm now going to ask for you to please refer to report number 2.
Okay.
And if you could please refer to page 27 of that report.
Counsel, before you get into your question, let me just ask the witness if he needs a break. We've been going a little over 2 hours. Do you need a...
I'm good till lunch, probably.
Good. Okay.
But thank you so much.
Go
I
ahead,
appreciate that.
Mr. Canterbury, if you could please take a moment to review the letter that is contained on page 27 of report number 2.
Yes, I've seen this.
That was going to be my next question. Let me ask you first, in the first sentence of the third paragraph of this letter that appears to be written by Ms. Sue Racer Troy, she states that she told you that the use of a state car or vehicle by Justice Ketchum would be a taxable fringe benefit if it was used for commuting, and she indicates that you told her that it was none of her business. Do you recall that conversation occurring?
No. I've answered that in a memorandum too that I don't know if it's attached to this report or not, but I answered that to the legislative post audit. It could have occurred. There was so much discussion about cars and taxes going back and forth. I can't say she did not ask that, but I can guarantee I didn't say it's none of your business. I had a very pleasant relationship with her, and I don't think I've ever told anybody it's none of their business in my entire life. So that's not my phrasing. I did not say that.
Do you recall speaking with Ms. Racer Troy about the taxable fringe benefit issues for use of state cars?
Generally, I think after the memorandum from Kirk that I requested, so that's why it also makes little sense that I would have said none of your business. Obviously, I'd requested a legal opinion on it, for goodness sake, so I don't know where that comes from, but I don't remember any details of that discussion one way or the other. But no doubt she could have said something to me. I just absolutely strongly deny that I would have ever told her it was none of her business.
If you could please now refer to it in the notebook, exhibit number 14. Mm-hmm. And specifically, I would like to ask you questions about the last page of this letter that appears to be from Ms. Sue Racer Troy, number 6. If you could just take a moment to review that.
I don't
please.
think I've seen this before. Okay.
First, let me ask you, did you have an employee at the time you were the administrator named Connie Toney?
Yes.
Do you have any information at all as to whether or not Miss Tony was afforded use of a state-owned vehicle for commuting purposes to and from the Capitol?
No, but I think I might be able to explain the confusion.
Okay, if you could, please.
I hired her son as an intern, and that year the interns were measuring accessibilities to court functions in various counties. They were in state cars. There were 4 of them. They had state cars to drive hither and to the various counties. I think that a couple of times he had the state car in southern counties. They lived, I think, in Logan County. I'm not even sure it was Logan. It's Southern County, that's all I can tell you. And he probably brought her to work one day, or a couple of days maybe, when he had the car, because he had the use of the car because he was going from county to county, along with a couple of others, to measure and to determine accessibility. That report was a very good report, too.
Mr. Canterbury, I now want to turn your attention to your termination that occurred in January of 2017. I have a few questions about that. I want to make sure first that we have the date correct. Was it January 4, 2017?
Yes, it was January 4. I heard the confusion. January 1st was a Sunday. January 2nd was the holiday. January 3rd, I was in Huntington dealing with some matters with the new family court function, so the first time they could get to me was January 4th.
So January 3rd was a work day, but you were not in the office. You were elsewhere working.
I was in the office in the morning, but then I went to Huntington. I don't know if they were seeking me on the 3rd or not.
How did you become aware on January 4th that your employment was being terminated?
In about 10 or so in the morning, I was asked to come up to the court. That was not an unusual occurrence, these spontaneous requests. I went up. I didn't expect what I learned. I went into the office, into the conference room. I could tell that there was a problem because there was emotion on everyone's faces. Chief Justice Lawfrey said, "You're being terminated from your will and pleasure position." He said, "Do you want to be terminated, or would you rather be allowed to resign?" I said, "No, I'd be terminated." I said, I wouldn't qualify for unemployment benefits if I were resigning, and I said I would probably need those. Justice Walker then said that I was wrong, that people who quit got unemployment benefits all the time. It was one of the 2 cross moments I had in the room. I said, well, when you've been around longer than a few days, you'll learn that the court never allowed people who quit to get any kind of unemployment benefits. I then, frankly, humbled myself and practically begged them to keep me on. I said, I'm the president-elect of the Conference of State Court Administrators. I'm on the National Center Board, and I'm going to be vice chairman. I'm going to be chairman of the Justice Center of the Council of State Governments. In those positions on the boards already, I've helped bring money back to this state, significant money. I'll be able to do that. Would you please just give me a year and a half to be able to do more of that? They said no. They wanted me gone. They wanted me gone. I also asked if I could have a few days because I had a lot of my furniture and my stuff in the office, a lot. 11 and a half years, you build up a lot. And they said no. By the end of the day, he said no. By the end of the day, I was to be gone. Justice Workman said, you've had a good run, now get along. And she did that, which I found to be kind of demeaning. And I guess that's why I broke bad at that point. That's when I said, well, every cloud has a silver lining. At least I will not have to work for a simulacrum of a chief like you. And he said, what did you call me? And I said, well, I described you as a simulacrum. He said, what's that word? What's it mean? And I said, look it up. And I'm literally getting my things and getting up. And he said, how do you spell it? I found that to be puzzling, and I said, well, figure that out yourself or something like that. And I said, I'm not going to spell it for you. And I left. I see a lot of puzzled expressions about what simulacrum means. Simulacrum means an elaborate fraud. It seemed the best word to describe him at the time. I was angry.
Let me ask you, before you left the conference room, did you indicate that this meeting occurred in the conference room?
Yes, it did.
Were all 5 justices present?
Yes, they were.
Other than Justice Lawfrey, and you have indicated that when you first walked in, is he the first person that spoke to you?
Yes, he was. Well, actually, Menace Ketchum was in the hall, and he just shook his head, and he said, I hate this. And I thought, this is a problem. But I still didn't think I was going to be fired. And with your leave, I'll explain why, but I won't if it's off subject.
Yeah, no, if you could.
Well, I'd worked very intensely with Justice Walker on her transition. In fact, she thought I did such a good job, she wrote me a lovely thank you note. But I'd heard through the grapevine that Justice Workman had turned strongly against me, and that Justice Lawfrey clearly hadn't liked me in years. And so I thought it might come to a vote. And I said to her on the last Friday of the year, I hate to put you on the spot, but you're about to be on the spot. It looks like you would be the 3rd vote if I'm going to be terminated. I said, are you going to vote to terminate me? And she said, well, I'd have to work with you for some months before I could make that decision. The reason that was so important to me was because I had already drafted a letter of resignation, because I knew that if I did not resign before the end of the year, I would use or lose annual days that totaled $15,000, $18,000. And so I wanted to try to keep that money. And I would, if she just told me the truth that she was going to vote with them, I would have resigned and I would have not lost that money. And so I thought, well, I mean, she wrote me a nice thank you card. I mean, I'd take her at her word, you know. So within a week of receiving the thank you card, she voted to fire me.
And just want to make sure that we're clear about that is Justice Walker. Okay.
Justice Walker.
And now let me ask you about back at the conference. I understand that Justice Ketchum spoke to you in the hallway, and then when you went in, Justice Lawfrey, was he the first justice to speak?
Yes, after we all sat down, he was the first person to say a word to me.
Was anyone else in the conference room other than yourself and the 5 justices?
No.
Okay. After Justice Lawfrey indicated that you were being terminated, do you recall any of the other justices, other than Justice Workman, that you've indicated that she asked you to leave? Anybody else, any other justices make any comments to you whatsoever?
And what I said about Justice Walker, which I've already said, which she said that unemployment, blah, blah, blah. No, neither Justice Davis nor Justice Ketchum said a word. I think they'd had an argument for the previous hour, and they'd probably expended all of their, because they voted for me to stay.
You have indicated the vote and who voted for and against your termination. How did you become aware of that?
Well, by their faces, I knew it, but I think later Justice Ketchum told me, perhaps, I don't remember, frankly, one of the justices told me. It would have been either Justice Davis or Justice Ketchum. I haven't spoken to any of the others since that day.
Well, that was another question I was going to ask you. I think you just answered it. Since the date you left the court in January of 2017, you have not spoken to Justice Lawfrey?
No.
And the same with respect to Justice Workman?
That's correct.
And finally, with respect to Justice Walker, have you spoken with her since that date?
No, I have not.
Let me ask you this with respect to Justice Davis. Have you spoken with her since the time you left the court?
Yes, I have.
Oh, and how is that a frequent occurrence or an infrequent occurrence?
You know, frequent, I guess. You know, every couple of weeks or so, sometimes more often, sometimes less.
With respect to Justice Ketchum, was that the same? Did you speak with him after January 4, 2017?
Well, he was very hopeful that I'd be able to get another job in government, and he was talking to me a lot about that in January and February of 2017. Then I didn't talk to him again until about December of 2017. And the last time I spoke with him was probably February of this year, and I haven't talked to him since. And that was just a couple of conversations, probably 3, between December 17 and February 18.
Other than the one comment that you made with respect to Justice Lawfrey as you were leaving the conference that day, do you recall making any threats to any of the justices or to the court in general while you were in the conference room or while you were leaving the conference room?
I never threatened them. The word got around the Capitol I'd been fired, and the press was calling. But I had time to talk to Phil Kabler for a moment, but I was under the gun to move my stuff. I mean, things were broken. And I knew that if I let someone else, it would just be a mess. And I didn't have time to talk to him. And I remember saying something like, I don't know whether to go to the press and tell them everything I know or just sail off into the sunset. And I guess I decided to sail off into the sunset for a long time.
At some point after you left that day, if you could please just generally describe to the committee how you got your belongings and left the building that day.
Well, I'd been fired, so therefore the policy of the court was always that the security people would watch your every step. And so every step was watched by Jess Gundy and Arthur Angus. I asked if I could keep or pay for my 12-year-old Nokia cell phone. That was denied. I asked if I could transfer the data on it. That was denied. I asked if I could have the phone number, which I'd had since the Regional Jail Authority. It was my number. That was denied. They took the phone. The computer was, of course, immediately disabled. And then I started packing furiously. And and my assistants were finding boxes and old newspapers and anything I could pack things in, and I went through files with Arthur looking at over my shoulder. I mean, it's not like he reviewed each file, but I would say, well, this file's my Christmas card list, that's mine. This file should stay for my successor, etc. So I left most of the files. There were relatively few files that I took. It was clear that it was physically impossible for me to drive the 30 minutes to my house in my car and back and get more stuff and back. I wouldn't have been able to finish. And so Arthur said, we'll use the vans. Arthur was in charge of the cars. I don't know if he got permission from the court. I have no idea. Just suddenly we were putting things in vans as well. So there were 2 vans in my car that made the first trip, and then the next trip we filled my car literally to the brim, and I was able to cram some things in there where unfortunately I cracked a very nice lamp, but that's the end of there.
And if you recall, how long during the day, how long did that take before you made the final trip?
All day. We didn't get finished till about 8 or 9 o'clock, I guess. I was very sore the next couple of days from just moving so hard and so fast. It was pandemonious.
The request that you made regarding your cell phone that you have indicated about whether or not you could, your request to keep the number and such, to whom did you make those requests?
I asked Arthur to ask Justice Lawfrey, the Chief Justice, and he said no, and all the things I told you were through him.
He said no.
Chief Justice Lawfrey through, I don't remember if it was Jess Gundy or Arthur Angus, through one of them.
Could you please tell the committee, now I'm really going to bounce around, I apologize. Could you please tell the committee how many Cass Gilbert desks the Supreme Court had while you were there?
Well, I think 5. I think originally there were 6. There's been a lot of discussion about that. I don't know that anybody has the exact data or the information about this. There are some letters back and forth between the Chief Justice at the time and Cass Gilbert's architectural office, but I think there was one for the clerk and one for each of the justices. Now, when you say desks, what you mean are the executive desks.
Yes, sir.
There were also secretary desks. And what I'm not remembering exactly is if the secretary in Justice Ketchum's office had a secretary's desk or if she had one of the executive desks. And I honestly I'd have to measure it. They look so much alike. It's the secretary desks are smaller versions, and there are some other details that are different, but at a glance they look a lot alike. But they're very, very clearly Cass Gilbert desks.
Mr. Chairman, if you'll give me just one moment.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Canterbury, I have just a few additional follow-up questions. With respect to the renovations, I know you have indicated there was the original bid and you went from that, and then it appears that much of the work went by change order as opposed to additional bid. Can you just please explain how that came about, that the work was done, for the most part, it appears, by change orders?
Well, as I said, the justices were very pleased with the work of the people who represented Nabergall, and you can extend a contract through a change order, and we extended their contracts for the other projects.
Okay, all through change orders?
All through change orders.
Okay. Now I'd like to ask you to please refer to report number 3. And specifically page 15 of report number 3. At the top of page 15, at the first bullet point, there is a note that the court did not seek reappropriations of approximately $10 million in expenditures in an attempt to bring the year-end balance as close to zero as possible, mainly to continue to forestall a constitutional amendment. And then there is the second sentence notes, the court discussed the need to eliminate any carryover money at the end of the year so that the Senate leadership would not continue down the path towards the sponsorship of such amendment. My question for you with respect to those statements, I believe that is talking about fiscal year 2014, when you note the court discussed, do you recall, did that include all justices at that time?
I don't recall. Generally, they would have all been in there, but I don't recall.
Okay. Do you recall any justice taking issue with that plan in the attempt to forestall the constitutional amendment? Absolutely not.
No one had any comment to the contrary that I recall.
With respect to the rental car usage, and I'm going to ask you specifically with respect to Justice Lawfrey, I think you indicated you might have been at 1 or 2 conferences that he was at. You've mentioned, I think, at least 2.
Yes.
Did you ever become aware as to whether or not anyone other than Justice Lawfrey was driving his rental car? And by that I mean, was it just Justice Lawfrey or his wife, if you know?
I don't know. And also, I need to clarify, at Asheville, I don't think he had a rental car. I was just talking, I was responding to his not going to some of the conferences.
I apologize. That's correct. You did
I
not.
want to make
I don't
sure
think
that
you
that's
said
the
that.
case. Right.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think I have any further questions at this time.
Thank you, Counsel. Mr. Canterbury, our typical practice, and you may have picked this up if you followed any of this, is to allow our committee members to ask questions in follow-up. However, in view of the fact you've been on 2.5+ hours, I think maybe it'd be a good time to break for an early lunch to give you a break and also to give our members a chance to collect their thoughts. And just so no one's surprised, I'm going to rotate around a little bit on who I start with. I will start with the back row on the right side first and work my way from my right to my left and then come that way. So that gives, nobody's going to be surprised when we come back. We will be in recess until 12:45. That gives everybody just a little over an hour. I've been told the cafeteria is open till 1:30, so please be back in your seats at 12:45. We're in recess until then.